1 Kings chapter 9. Verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass, when Solomon had finished the building of the house of the Lord and the king's house, and all Solomon's desire which he was pleased to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon the second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said unto him, I have heard thy prayer and thy supplication that thou hast made before me. I have hallowed this house which thou hast built, to put my name there forever, and mine eyes and mine heart shall be there perpetually. And if thou wilt walk before me as David thy father walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded thee, and will keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of thy kingdom upon Israel forever, as I promised to David thy father, saying, There shall not fail thee a man upon the throne of Israel. But if ye shall at all turn from following me, ye or your children, and will not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then will I cut off Israel out of the land which I have given them, and this house which I have hallowed for my name will I cast out of my sight. And Israel shall be a proverb and a byword among all people. And this house which is high, everyone that passeth by it shall be astonished, and shall hiss, and they shall say, Why hath the Lord done thus unto this land, unto this house? And they shall answer, Because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought forth their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and have taken hold upon other gods, and have worshipped them, and served them. Therefore hath the Lord brought upon them all this evil. And it came to pass at the end of 20 years, when Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house. And it says, Now Hiram the king of Tyre had furnished Solomon with cedar trees and fir trees and with gold, according to all his desire. That then King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities out of the land of Galilee. And Hiram came out from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they pleased him not. And he said, What cities are these which thou hast given me, my brother? And he called them the land of Cabul unto this day. And Hiram sent to the king 60 talents of gold. And this is the reason of the levy which King Solomon raised, for to build the house of the Lord, and his own house, and Milo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. For Pharaoh king of Egypt had gone up, and taken Gezer, and burnt it with fire, and slain the Canaanites that dwelt in the city, and given it for a present unto his daughter Solomon's wife. And Solomon built Gezer, and Beth-horon in the nether, and Baalath, and Tadmor in the wilderness in the land, and all the cities of store that Solomon had, and cities for his chariots, and cities for his horsemen. And that which Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem and in Lebanon and all the land of his dominion, and all the people that were left of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, which were not of the children of Israel, their children that were left after them in the land, whom the children of Israel also were not able to utterly destroy, upon those did Solomon levy a tribute of bondservice unto this day. But of the children of Israel did Solomon make no bondmen, but they were men of war, and his servants, and his princes, and his captains, and rulers of his chariots, and his horsemen. These were the chief of the officers that were over Solomon's work, 550, which bear rule over the people that wrought in the work. Now, it says, But Pharaoh's daughter came up out of the city of David unto her house, which Solomon had built for her, and then did he build Milo. And 3 times in a year did Solomon offer burnt offerings and peace offerings upon the altar which he built unto the Lord. And he burnt incense upon the altar that was before the Lord, so he finished the house. And King Solomon made a navy of ships in Ezion-Geber, which is beside Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent in the navy his servants, shipmen that had knowledge of the sea, with the servants of Solomon. And they came to Ophir, and fetched from thence gold 420 talents, and brought it unto King Solomon. All right, so what we have here in chapter 9, and this will make more sense a little bit later, but what we have here in chapter 9 is kind of a summary of Solomon's reign up to this point. And this point is being the completion of the temple, because this is a significant moment in Solomon's reign and a significant moment in Israel's history. And so the temple, and this will make more sense as we go through, but the temple was never meant to be a symbolic gesture of goodwill from the people of Israel to God. In other words, it was not supposed to just simply be this edifice. It was supposed to be a means to facilitate the relationship of God to Israel. Right? It's not just supposed to be this fancy, illustrious, detailed, immaculate building that just kind of stood there and was something for people to look at. It was to be used, right? Everything that they built, all the instruments and all the things that they put into it, it served a purpose. And Israel was supposed to remember that purpose. And so the temple had a true function, which again, to facilitate the relationship of God to Israel. And so the question is, what would it be? Would it just stand there as an edifice, or would Israel actually use it to obediently worship God? God allowed them to build this, gave them the conditions necessary to build it, gave them the riches and the help necessary to build it for the purposes of keeping their relationship, having them keep their end of the covenant. And so it had a real purpose to serve. And so here, again, with the temple having been completed now, the question is, what were they going to do with it, right? Is this going to serve its actual purpose? And so Solomon now, he's finished, verse 1, finished with the building of the temple, finished with his palace. Chapter 9, you'll see building is heavily prevalent. We talk about building a lot. So all the building that Solomon had desired to do is kind of wrapped up. And so Solomon is now kind of finished with this chapter, I guess you could say, of his reign. And he tells them that he has hallowed the temple, that he has placed his name there. And these two things are significant because this is exactly what Solomon prayed for in the previous chapter. And so when Solomon's praying his dedicatory prayer, he prays and he asks God for these two things, and God's telling him, I've done this. I have answered your prayer. Essentially, here's what he's saying. All the necessary things that need to take place for Israel to properly worship God, they're there. They are in place. There is no excuse for Israel to not have everything that they need to properly worship and live according to the commands that God had given them. And so this has all been done. And then he says, should you live obediently, he says, I will establish the throne of thy kingdom upon Israel forever, as I promised to David thy father, saying, there shall not fail thee a man upon the throne of Israel. And so he consistently goes back to this covenant that he made with David. All right, and he tells Solomon, just be obedient. If you're obedient, if your children are obedient, the covenant will stand. It will continue to go, and there will be a son of David upon the throne. And so God promises fidelity to the covenant that he made with David. But again, the impetus was always obedience, and it was the same when he made the covenant with David. Right? Obedience is required. And so this was not an unconditional covenant. God has unconditional covenants. The Davidic covenant was not one of those. And so the Davidic covenant was conditional upon the obedience of whoever was sitting on the throne, which is why it didn't last forever, which is why there was a long gap and an absence of a king after the nation of Judah was taken to Babylon. And there has not been a Davidic king sit on that throne again until Christ returns. And so this is... again, this is all God keeping his covenant and doing exactly what he said he would do. And so the question is, well, how does Solomon live obedient? Why is this chapter here, in other words? By remembering the purpose of the now completed temple. Right? God is coming to Solomon now, after the temple has been completed, again, to tell him, you have everything you need. It's there. Now, they could have worshiped God properly before, but now, again, there's simply no excuse. Right? It's there. You have all the instruments. You have the altar. You have the ark. You have all the things that you could possibly need to obediently and faithfully follow God's command. However, and then there's a significant warning section here. Should Solomon or his children, and when he says children, the implication there is sons reigning, right? Your children, i.e., whoever is on the throne, kings, okay? So that's what he's saying. Should Solomon or his children, future kings, fail to be obedient, and should they worship other gods, God would cut off Israel out of the land which I have given them, and this house, which I have hallowed for my name, will I cast out of my sight, and Israel shall be a proverb and a byword among all people. And so again, it's tied to the obedience of the king. I'll come back to that thought in a moment. Now, it would come to the point where Israel itself would stand as a reminder, not of God's love, not of God's fidelity, but of God's wrath. And so it is interesting how all of these aspects, and we're going to talk more about this tonight, but all of these aspects are just as much a part of the nature of God as the other. Right? This is something that people don't like to think about. But God is a God of love. Yes, God is a God of grace and mercy. He is all of those things. He is also a God of judgment. He is also a God of wrath. Right? God's wrath is just as much a part of his nature than his love is. And if you remove any one of those aspects, God is not completely and fully God as we know him. And so God, through Israel, has shown a tremendous amount of love, tremendous amount of mercy and grace to the people of Israel so that the world can see it. But also, should Israel fail to be obedient, God would show another attribute to the world through Israel, that being his wrath, his indignation, his judgment. And unfortunately, that is eventually what happened. And so essentially it says people are going to, they're going to come through the land and they're going to see what was once this great nation. And Israel was, particularly under Solomon, as far as might and size. It was a better spiritual kingdom under David, but as far as might and size and just blessing and superiority, the kind of height of that was under Solomon. And so it was a great nation. But people would go through this and they would see, what happened. They would see the foundation to the temple, which they would know was once this grand, eloquent building. What happened? Right? And the answer that they could give was, well, they forsook their God. Right? God, they had a covenant. They had a fidelity that they were supposed to hold to this covenant that they failed to do. And so because they forsook their God, he did all this. Now, one thing I want to point out, and so verse 6, he says, but if you, Solomon, if you or your children stop from following me, then all of these things are going to happen. And then verse 9, it says, and they shall answer because they. Who's the they of verse 9? Verse 9 is talking about all of Israel. And so in verse 6, it shows that the leaders are forsaking God. And now because the leaders have forsaken God, now the whole nation has forsaken God. Again, I know we've talked about this quite a few times. But weak leaders create weak people. And this is true. And not just true for Israel. This is true. This is kind of a universal truth throughout all nations, all kingdoms, all governments. Weak leaders create weak people. This is true not just in governments. This is true in churches. This is true in any organization where you have leadership over that organization. Weak leaders create weak people. And so here, what does he say? If you stop following this, if your children, again, kings in the future, if they stop following this, it's inevitable that if that continues to take place, the people will stop following this. Now, that doesn't mean that the second Solomon sinned once, that the rest of the nation was just going to fall headlong into sin. That's not what that means. But if there's a continued pattern where the people are looking up at their king, at their ruler, at the one who's supposed to lead and guide them, and they're seeing this pattern of disbelief, this pattern of sin, this pattern of weakness, well, eventually that's going to creep down, and it's going to enter into the nation itself. And again, that's not to say that every single Israelite was a part of this, but by and large, the totality of the people, God would promise blessing and then give a stark warning. And so here he's doing that again. Again, this is a significant moment in Solomon's reign. You've done things mostly right. And I've talked about that. Solomon, I think, and I've said this probably too many times already, but Solomon, I think, gets a bad rap for the early part of his reign. Talk about the negative when we get to the negative. We'll get there in a couple chapters. But Solomon, to this point, I believe, has been a very good king. I believe that he has done things in a godly manner. I think that just by God blessing him is testament to this. But now, again, with this grand project finished, which is the height of Solomon's reign, the question is, now what are you going to do? I mean, if you've ever had, I'll just liken it to this. If you've ever had just a really big project that you've been working on, whatever that could be, something at work, something at the house, whatever, it doesn't matter, but something that has really taken a lot of time and effort and planning, and you've just been pumping a lot of time into this. Once that project is finished, it's almost like, well, what do I do now, right? And so for Solomon, for 7 years they've been building the temple. For 13 years he's been building his palace complex. And so obviously Solomon has been head first into all of this thing for nigh on a decade. Well, now this is completed. And so the question is, well, now, Solomon, what are you going to do? Right? What are you going to do with your time? How are you going to treat the people? And so this is a large question for Solomon, and it's important why chapter 9 is here following the completion of the temple. And so the rest of the chapter then is kind of what I mentioned at the beginning, is sort of a mid-reign summary of Solomon's kingship, of the things that he had done as king. Now, we have kind of almost like a disjointed summary, several little summaries that kind of stand under that banner as far as all of these are kind of giving us a picture of Solomon's reign. But it starts in verse 10 with this little summary of Hiram. And so Hiram, as we know, had been providing lumber. He had been providing work for the temple. And we also find out here in verse 14 that he had been providing a significant amount of gold. It says 60 talents of gold. This is a lot of gold. Now, we also, we know, having just read through it, that a tremendous amount of gold went into the construction of the temple. And so here, interestingly enough, we find out that Hiram had provided a good portion of the gold that was used for the construction of the temple. Now, we know from, was it chapter 5? Yeah, chapter 5, when Solomon and Hiram made this original deal for the lumber, that Hiram asked for food stores. We'll send you lumber, you send us food stores. And they agreed to do that, and they were doing that. But apparently this wasn't enough to cover the cost of the lumber and the gold. And so now Solomon decides to give Hiram control of these 20 cities in Galilee. And so Galilee would have been northern Israel. This would have been near the border of Hiram's territory and Solomon's territory. And these two men had a good relationship. Really, for Solomon's sake, there's really no risk in this. And so he gives Hiram control of these 20 cities. Hiram is not pleased with this. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing. I wish we could have a little bit more information on this, but nevertheless, Hiram sees these cities. It says in verse 12, and it says, and they pleased him not. He doesn't like the territory that Solomon had given to him. And it says that he names them at the end of verse 13, Kabul. Now, there's a lot of debate about this, but I would say there's a significant amount of people who think that he named them Kabul because it sounds almost identical. It's not the exact, but it sounds almost identical to the Hebrew word, which basically means good for nothing. And so essentially it's almost like a play on words here, and Hiram's making his opinions known. However, it's obvious when you finish the chapter that their relationship was not strained too much. Because you see in verses 26 through 28, it says, and King Solomon made a navy. And then verse 27, it says, and Hiram sent in the navy his servants, shipmen that had knowledge of the sea with the servants of Solomon. And so they actually had kind of a joint navy venture. And we talked about this a couple of chapters ago, that when Solomon made this deal with Hiram for the lumber, the Phoenicians were known not only for their lumber, but for their ability to transport that lumber. They had a knowledge of the seas that was kind of supreme at that particular time. And so Solomon was growing in strength, and as he grew in strength, as a nation grew in strength, they're most concerned. And so Hiram was not happy with the cities, but obviously it didn't hurt their relationship there too much. And so then we go on and we see that God is blessing Solomon in other ways. So verse 15, it says, and this is the reason of the levy which King Solomon raised for to build his house of the Lord. And then at the end of the verse, he says that he built Milo, he built the wall of Jerusalem, he built Hazor, he built Megiddo, he built Gezer. Down the line a little bit, in verse 17, Solomon built Gezer, Beth-horon, the Nether, and Baalath, and Tadmor in the wilderness. And so you see all these cities that Solomon is building up. These aren't just random cities for people to go build houses in. These were military strongholds. These were defensive in nature. The three there mentioned in verse 15 being the key. And so Hazor was in the north. Megiddo is centrally located in the Jezreel Valley, kind of almost right in the middle of Israel. And then Gezer was in the south. And so these were military strongholds. In fact, it specifically mentions for us in verse 16, it says, for Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and taken Gezer, burned it with fire, slain the Canaanites that dwelt in the city, and given it for a present unto his daughter. Whereas that worked out in Israel's favor, that Pharaoh went and did this, and then gave it to his daughter, which, as a reminder, is Solomon's wife. It would have been an eye-opening thing to Solomon. Should Egypt ever turn on us, that area is very easy for them to go and take, right? And so he takes that city that he had given to his daughter, and he turns it into a military stronghold. And so Solomon, obviously this is an understatement, Solomon is no fool. He understands, I might have good relationships with these guys now, but that doesn't mean I always will. That doesn't mean Israel always will. And so he institutes these strongholds in these very key strategic locations. And so God then furthermore, he gives him cities for his chariots, cities for his horsemen, and that which Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem and in Lebanon and all the land of his dominion. And so again, storehouses as it were, but mostly for military purposes. This is a defensive thing. And the reason I believe this is here is you can mostly correctly assume that if a nation is building up its military to this degree, that they are prosperous, that they have the means to do that. That's not always the case. But many, many times, if they're able to build up a strong military, that is usually an indication that they have the means to do so. Now, there are some, and we have seen this sometimes in history, who they try to do it when they don't have the means to do it, and the nation just crumbles because they don't have the infrastructure and the means to keep that military going. But nevertheless, here, this is an indication of God's blessing upon Solomon. And so to complete all of the building that Solomon was doing, we kind of get this interesting little tidbit here, that Solomon takes, verse 20, all the people that were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, which were not of the children of Israel, that their children that were left after them in the land, whom the children of Israel also utterly destroy. And so Solomon takes all the inhabitants of the land who were there prior to Israel's conquering of Israel, the ones who should not have been there. Right? This is a thorn in the side of Israel, because God's original command was to go in and what? Wipe them out. Not just take out the ones that are the easiest and leave the hardest. No, the command of God was to wipe the people out. And I know people don't like that, but this was a means of judgment against those nations for the ungodly deeds that they had done. And so God's command wiped them out. And consistently throughout the Pentateuch, you get into Joshua, you get into Judges, they don't do that. They failed to do that. And so now there's still a significant portion left. Right? It's not just one people group. Look at, again, verse 20. They're Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, all of these people groups who still have descendants left in the land that were not wiped out. And so Solomon takes them and he basically enslaves them. He puts them into bond service. Now, anytime you talk about slavery in the Bible, we have to understand is a whole other type of thing than what the typical 21st century American thinks of slavery. It wasn't the chattel slavery that happened in the Americas. It's a different kind of thing. And so beyond that, there were built-in protections in the law for slaves. There were built-in protections that God gave to how you could treat a slave. And so it's not the same thing as we think about today. And so, let's not compare apples and oranges here. But he puts them into bond service. Now, he didn't do that with the children of Israel. He does that with the people who were left. Now, so the reason I mention all that is because it can be debated, and it is. It can be debated if Solomon should have done this. Should he have enslaved entire people groups? Like I said, we're not talking about the same thing, but nevertheless. However, what can't be debated is if the Israelites had been faithful to God's original command, there wouldn't have been a people to enslave. He wouldn't have had the option to do it if Israel had been faithful centuries before. And I would submit in the centuries since. Because that command, it's not as if it just went away. Right? God told them to wipe them out. And it's not as if since the original group of Israelites who conquered Israel didn't do it, well, God just threw up his hand and said, well, I guess don't do it now. No, every generation Joshua took them in could have done this and should have done this. And so here, the only thing that I think that Solomon did that was wrong was enslave them instead of wipe them out, because that's what should have happened. Nevertheless, here we are, Solomon enslaving them, and he uses that for all the building that's going on with regards to Israel. Not necessarily the temple or the palace, but the building of the nation of Israel. Now, verse 25 seems to be the key here. It says, and 3 times a year did Solomon offer burnt offerings and peace offerings upon the altar which he built unto the Lord, and he burnt incense upon the altar that was before the Lord, so he finished the house. And so, again, what did God tell him at the beginning of the chapter? Be faithful. Be obedient. And verse 25 shows us, to this point, he has been. To this point, he is being obedient. And so what verse 25 is in reference to is that there were 3 feasts, yearly feasts that took place where all the males of Israel were supposed to go to Jerusalem for this particular feast. And so this was both a means for Israel to display their praise to God, because that would be taking place in the feast, but it was also a means for Israel to display their faithfulness. Because if all the males of Israel were going to that one centrally located area, and if you were an enemy of Israel and you knew that, if I was ever going to attack, it would have been during one of those times, right? Not only do you have all of the males right there, you have no males leaving or protecting the rest of the land. and so at least not military-age males. And so this was a way for Israel to prove their praise and worship, but also to prove their faith that God would protect them as they're going and doing these particular feasts. And Solomon kept this. Again, 3 times in a year did Solomon offer burnt offerings. He kept the feast as God had called them to. And so we'll see in chapter 11, the time of Solomon's apostasy is quickly approaching. But what is clear by this chapter is that at this point, Solomon is faithful and God is blessing. I think that's what, if you see anything in chapter 10, see that. Solomon is faithful and God is blessing. How is God blessing? He's blessing because he gave them the temple, he gave them this grand palace complex, and now he's letting Israel be built up militarily. He's letting Israel be built up to become this great, great nation. And then chapter 11, Solomon has all these wives. They draw his heart away from God, and from that point, it's just downhill. It's downhill from that point on. And so 9 times in this chapter, there is a form of the word build. And so 9 times we'll see that God was clearly using Solomon to bless and to grow the kingdom of Israel. And this is why, again, one of the reasons why I'm so adamant that we don't read the end of Solomon's reign into the beginning of Solomon's reign. Right? He's going to do bad things, and we'll talk about that. But here, very clearly and very obviously, I believe, God is blessing Israel through Solomon. And he is growing Israel to a point, like I said, militarily, as far as size. I don't think spiritually they were strong as they were under David. But I don't think it was a significant drop-off. And so here, Solomon is being blessed. Why is he being blessed? Because he's being faithful. That is in keeping with every blessing and cursing section that we've had from the book of Exodus. And so God promises blessing through obedience. Solomon is obedient. Solomon is faithful. Therefore, God is blessing. And Solomon is building. And not just for him, but for the purposes of the nation of Israel. And so the chapter stands then as a look to both the blessing of God, but it also is an obvious warning from God. And so God had blessed Solomon. God had made Solomon wise. He had made him rich beyond any other person, beyond any other king. He gave him the peace that was necessary to build the temple, to build up Israel itself. And so, like I said, this chapter is here for a reason, because now Solomon cannot become complacent. This is what I was talking about earlier. Solomon's whole, time, probably for a decade now, has been just spent and taken up by these large construction projects. Solomon hasn't had time to think of having 900 wives and concubines. He hasn't had time to do that. All of his time has been caught up in this. But now that's over. Now Solomon has time. And now that Solomon has time, are you going to be faithful with that time, or are you going to be disobedient with that time? And so Solomon can't become complacent. And so neither Solomon nor us today should think that previous commitment will automatically, and I use that word on purpose, will automatically produce current faithfulness. We can't just think, well, I've been through tough times before, and I made it then, so I don't have to worry about it now. No, we always remain vigilant. We always keep the main things the main things. We're adamant that we're being obedient, that we're being faithful, that we're consistent in our prayer time, that we're consistent reading the scriptures, that we're consistent with church attendance, being a part of a body of Christ. And so these things will continuously aid us, because if we think, if I think, there was a time in my life that was really difficult, and God brought me through that, and I was able to endure all that, then I don't have to really worry about things now. No, remain vigilant. And Solomon didn't do this. And this was his downfall. And like I said, we were looking ahead of ourselves a little bit, but this will be very, very clear over the next couple of chapters. And so I want to read this quote here from Davis. He says, "We must not forget that verses 6 through 9 stand like a Mount Rushmore peering down over verses 10 through 28. One may be enjoying a thoroughly successful kingly," and he says, or financial, or professional, or ministerial. One might be enjoying a thoroughly successful kingly career and yet end in utter ruin unless one takes obedience to the first commandment as his very highest calling. And so here, again, Solomon had every opportunity, once the temple was completed, to basically ample opportunity to turn from serving God to putting God behind him and setting Solomon up on a pedestal as he said, if we fail to make the first commandment our highest priority, which is to worship God above alone, it's very, very easy to fall into basically any trap, that Satan lays for us. And so this is what I'm trying to say. Don't become complacent. Don't just expect that, well, things are always going to work out because they always have, or anything like that. Just remain dedicated, remain committed, remain vigilant. And I think the scriptures bear that out for us. So that was chapter 9. Solomon only has a couple more chapters. This is what's so interesting to me, is that as grand a kingdom as Solomon had, we get significantly less information about Solomon than we did David. And, of course, I understand David is kind of the central character of the Old Testament, so that makes sense for us. But we only got 2 more chapters on Solomon, and then we get to the split of the nation. And like I said, from that point, it's a downward trajectory. For the southern kingdom, there's a little bit of up and down, but overall down. And unfortunately, that's kind of how things go from Israel from that point forward. But we'll see that as we finish out 1st and 2nd Kings. All right.